The Wyoming Territory was quiet that late summer afternoon, the kind of quiet that seemed to settle into the bones of the land, giving everything an almost eternal feel. The stagecoach rolled into the small town depot with a creak of wood and a cloud of dust that hung thick in the air. There were three women on the coach, each dressed in fine, polished clothing, their hats perched just so, a picture of grace and elegance. They were the type of women every man in the town had been waiting for, polished, perfect, and full of promise. But it wasn't the polished ladies who Caleb Merritt's eyes fell on. No, his gaze was locked on the last woman to step off the stagecoach, a young woman whose appearance was far from the pristine expectations. She stepped down awkwardly, her shoes tattered and worn, her dress patched and mended, looking like she'd been through 100 hardships. The other women stared, their gloved hands hiding behind the folds of their dresses, whispering behind their fans. They didn't hide their surprise well. Emmeline Grace, that was her name. She looked around, trembling slightly, a letter in her hand that wasn't even meant for her. It had been addressed to Sarah Crawford, the woman Caleb had requested as his bride. Emmeline's heart raced. The weight of the mistake was clear on her face. I'm not who you asked for," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the wind. Caleb, however, didn't seem the least bit surprised. His eyes softened as he looked at her. He walked past the other two brides, who were clearly more to his expectation, and stopped in front of Emmeline. His gaze was steady, warm. "You brought all I ever needed," he said. His words seemed to hang in the air, leaving the crowd stunned, unsure of whether he was mocking her or not. The other women were speechless. The whispers around the depot grew louder. Emmeline felt like shrinking into the dust under her feet, unsure how to respond. How could he mean it? She wasn't what he wanted. She was nothing like the elegant Sarah Crawford. But Caleb didn't wait for an answer. He turned and began walking toward the wagon, motioning for her to follow. His calm demeanor, despite the misunderstanding, was almost enough to make Emmeline believe he meant what he said. The wagon journey to Merritt Ranch was an uncomfortable silence. Emmeline sat on a rough bench, gripping the side as they bumped over the uneven trail. Caleb, seated across from her, didn't speak either, his hands resting lightly on his knees. The quiet stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. After a while, Emmeline could no longer take the silence. I'm sorry. I don't know what to do," she stammered. "I didn't mean to take Sarah's place. She eloped. I only came because I didn't have anywhere else to go." Caleb raised a hand to stop her, his expression unreadable. "Then I'm grateful for Sarah's mistake," he said calmly. "At least someone's been sent to me who can handle the truth." Emmeline swallowed hard, trying to understand what he meant. The weight of her own life pressed down on her shoulders. Orphaned at a young age, she had spent years in an overcrowded orphanage, overlooked by almost everyone. She had always longed for a place to belong, a family who might see her for who she truly was, and not just another face in a crowd. But she had never expected that longing to lead her here, to this ranch, to a man like Caleb Merritt. Her thoughts drifted as the wagon crested a hill, and she saw the vast Merritt Ranch spread out before her. The land was more than she had ever imagined. Wide open fields, a sprawling ranch house, and barns that seemed to go on forever. She felt small, insignificant, her fear growing with every inch closer they came. What could a man like Caleb possibly want with her? As the wagon slowly approached the grand house, Caleb turned to her. "It's not much," he said, almost as though reading her mind. "But it's home." Emmeline nodded, but didn't trust herself to speak. The house was more than she had ever imagined, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. Not in this place. Not with him. The staff, when they arrived, were just as cold as the house. Mrs. Abigail Winters, the housekeeper, barely looked up as Emmeline stepped inside. She eyed her torn shoes with open disdain. Gabe, the foreman, barely acknowledged her presence. The other maids gave her quick, appraising glances before returning to their work. Caleb seemed to sense the tension in the air. He gave Emmeline a brief smile before excusing himself to tend to the horses, leaving her alone with the judgmental staff. That night, after a long day of uncomfortable silences and awkward exchanges, Emmeline was alone in the guest room. The quiet of the house was unsettling. The room was plain, but it was hers for now. She sat on the bed, feeling lost in the vastness of the house, when she saw a small box placed at the foot of the bed. Curious, she opened it, finding a pair of new shoes inside, perfectly her size. Along with them was a note, written in rough handwriting, "For tomorrow. Keep the others. They brought you here." Emmeline ran her fingers over the shoes. Why would Caleb do this? What did he see in her? Was it pity, compassion, or something else she couldn't quite understand? As she held both pairs of shoes, her thoughts went back to Caleb. She had never expected to be treated this way. She had never imagined that anyone could look past her worn shoes and her humble appearance to see something more. She didn't know if she was ready to understand what Caleb saw in her, but in that moment she wished she could. Across the hall, Caleb sat in his room, staring at the scars on his hands. He whispered a quiet prayer, the same one he had prayed for months. "Thank you for sending her." Emmeline woke up the next morning in a house that felt foreign, unsure whether she belonged. The shoes Caleb had given her were on the floor beside her bed, still new and untouched. She slipped them on, feeling the weight of his silent gesture, but she didn't know how to interpret it. Caleb, it seemed, spoke a different language than most, not with words, but with the quiet, thoughtful actions that spoke louder than anything he could say. During the first week, the days passed in a haze of awkward silence. Mrs. Winters kept her distance, never missing an opportunity to remind Emmeline that she wasn't part of the family, that she wasn't to interfere with the house's running. Gabe, the foreman, politely rejected any help Emmeline tried to offer with the ranch's bookkeeping. She spent long hours alone, watching Caleb from the windows as he worked tirelessly, managing the land and horses with a quiet intensity that both humbled and intimidated her. But as the days went on, she began to notice the small, silent gifts he left for her. Her torn shoes, cleaned and returned each morning. A warm cup of coffee waiting at her door when she woke. A jar of wildflowers placed on her breakfast tray. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Emmeline to begin to understand that Caleb didn't speak with grand gestures or overt words. He communicated with simple acts of kindness, and though he never said a word about them, Emmeline knew they came from him. Soon, she found herself leaving small things for him in return. A mended shirt, a wrapped biscuit, anything to show that she saw him too. It was a language of quiet gestures, a dance of giving that neither of them dared to speak about, but both felt. One day, Caleb took Emmeline into the nearby town of Graston to pick up supplies. The townspeople stared, whispering as they always did. A woman at the general store eyed her curiously. "So, you're the unexpected bride?" she said. Emmeline, ever the outsider, shrugged and replied, "I'm the unexpected everything." Caleb overheard and, with a calm smile, stepped in. "She's exactly what was expected," he said. It was a strange moment, but it made Emmeline feel, just for a second, that maybe she wasn't the mistake she thought she was. As the rain began to fall on the way back to the ranch, something in Emmeline finally broke open. She laughed, feeling the weight of the day lift off her shoulders. Caleb glanced at her, mesmerized by the sound of her laughter, a laugh that was unguarded and free. Mrs. Winters, of course, had something to say about it later. "She'll catch her death out there in the rain," she muttered, but Caleb simply replied, "She looks alive." That evening, Emmeline was alone in her room again when she found a book of poetry sitting on her nightstand. It was worn, its pages dog-eared, but it was the writing inside that made her pause. One line was underlined in Caleb's handwriting. "We love the things we love for what they are." Emmeline traced the words slowly, her heart picking up pace. Was Caleb telling her something? He had given her this book, this line. Could it mean what she hoped it did? And then, later that week, in the quiet of the barn, Emmeline discovered Caleb's greatest secret. She had gone to check on her mare, a horse Caleb had given her for the ride to town, when she found Caleb working late into the night, mucking the stalls. He was shirtless, his back to her, and it wasn't until he turned that she saw the burn scars that covered his back and shoulders. Her gasp broke the silence. He quickly grabbed his shirt, covering himself, and the tension in the air was palpable. Caleb, though, let the silence stretch before he finally spoke. He told her about his past, about the woman he had once loved, Victoria Ashford, and the fire that had scarred him both physically and emotionally. The fire, set by a business rival, had nearly taken his life, and Victoria had turned away, unable to see beyond his scars. The humiliation and rejection had followed him ever since. Caleb had written that letter, requesting a refined bride, because that's what everyone expected of him. But when he saw Emmeline step off the stagecoach, broken and humble, her shoes worn and her dress mended, he realized that she was exactly what he had been praying for. She wasn't perfect, and that was exactly what he needed. Emmeline touched the scars on his back, and for the first time, Caleb let someone see him for who he truly was, not just as the man who had lost everything, but the man who had been willing to rebuild. For Emmeline, in that moment, something shifted. She didn't just see Caleb for the first time, she saw herself. She wasn't a mistake. She wasn't a wrong bride. She was exactly who Caleb needed, too. But little did she know, their journey was only just beginning, and the past was waiting to make its return. The walls between Caleb and Emmeline had begun to crumble after their quiet revelation in the barn, but the walls inside their hearts were far more stubborn. It wasn't easy to open up to someone after years of loneliness and loss, especially for Caleb, who had buried himself behind layers of emotional armor. Yet, Emmeline had a way of slowly chipping away at those walls, not with force, but with her presence, her quiet compassion, and the steady rhythm of her life at Merritt Ranch. The first breakthrough came the following morning when Caleb, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him, knocked on her door. "Would you have dinner with me tonight?" At the table, he asked, his voice low, as though unsure of the answer. Emmeline, equally surprised, agreed. The evening started awkwardly in the grand, silent dining room, both of them unsure of how to act. Caleb, usually confident and assertive, admitted, "I don't know how to do this." Emmeline, always honest, replied with a smile, "Neither do I. Maybe we make our own way." So, they left the formal dining room behind and carried their meal out to the porch, where the quiet of the night and the star-filled sky offered a more fitting backdrop. As they ate, the conversation shifted from formalities to deeper topics: books, childhoods, dreams. Every word, every laugh seemed to draw them closer, and by the end of the evening, the awkwardness had melted away, replaced by the comfortable silence of two people who had found their own rhythm. This became their nightly ritual, a tradition born not out of expectation, but necessity. As the days passed, Emmeline found herself becoming more involved with the ranch. She started planting a garden, wildflowers, and vegetables sprouting from the soil where nothing had grown before. Mrs. Winters, who had once regarded her with suspicion, now watched silently, but with a hint of approval in her gaze. One afternoon, as Emmeline worked the soil, Caleb watched her from a distance, but this time he joined her, pulling weeds silently. Their partnership was growing, but it wasn't just in the garden. In the house, Caleb began to notice how Emmeline had started teaching the ranch children to read, gathering them around the kitchen table every evening for lessons. It was a small act, but to Caleb, it was monumental. He watched her with pride as she encouraged the children, helping them understand a world beyond the ranch, beyond the hardships they knew. Mrs. Winters, though still silent, couldn't hide her approval. The work Emmeline was doing was slowly, quietly, changing the dynamics of the house. One evening, After a particularly long day, Caleb found Emmeline in the parlor, standing beside an old, neglected piano. He hadn't known about the piano, not really. It had been forgotten, hidden under dust and old sheets. Emmeline, self-taught and imperfect, began to play, her fingers tentative at first, but gaining confidence as the notes flowed. Caleb stood in the doorway, listening, captivated by the sound that filled the room, a sound that seemed to bring the house alive in a way it hadn't been before. Later, he opened the door, watching her play as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Would you play something for me?" he asked, and Emmeline nodded, playing a tune she had learned long ago. They didn't speak about it, not with words, but in that moment, they were communicating something far deeper than either of them could have said. Music had always been a language of the soul, and it was becoming their own silent language, the space where they connected without needing to say a word. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. Caleb, though still a man of few words, began to open up in his own way. He was learning to listen to the quiet language Emmeline spoke, the language of simple acts and subtle gestures. And Emmeline, for the first time in her life, began to feel like she was truly seen, not just as a bride who had been delivered by mistake, but as someone who had found a place where she belonged, and perhaps someone who had found a love that was more real than she had ever imagined. But despite the growth of their bond, there was still the lingering question of the past, of Victoria Ashford, the woman Caleb had once loved, the woman who had left him because of his scars. And with every passing day, Emmeline began to wonder whether the past would ever truly leave them, or whether it would rise up and tear apart the fragile bond they had begun to form. And so, though their love was growing, the looming shadow of what was to come kept both of them on edge, unsure of what the future would hold. The past has a way of creeping back into the present, no matter how deep one tries to bury it. For Caleb Merritt, it came in the form of a woman in expensive traveling clothes, her confidence as polished as the boots she wore. Victoria Ashford, his former fiancée, had returned, and with her, all the unresolved pain that Caleb had hoped would remain buried forever. The morning after Victoria's arrival, the house was still, the kind of stillness that makes the air feel heavy. Caleb and Emmeline sat at breakfast, their usual peace shattered by the sudden arrival of Mrs. Winters, who had never looked more uncomfortable. "Sir," she said, avoiding Caleb's gaze, "you have a visitor." Miss Victoria Ashford. Caleb's fork froze midair. Emmeline, unsure of what was happening, looked up to see Caleb's expression shift, something between surprise and something darker, something he hadn't shown her before. The door opened, and there she stood, as if she had never left. Victoria's eyes scanned the room, briefly resting on Emmeline, who could feel the tension rising in her chest. Victoria's gaze was cool, assessing as she finally spoke. "Caleb," she said softly, almost too gently, "it's been too long." Caleb, unable to hide the turmoil rising inside him, muttered a greeting, but there was no warmth in his voice. "Victoria," he said, the word feeling strange on his tongue. Emmeline, not knowing what to say, sat quietly, the air thick with a heaviness she couldn't explain. She had heard stories of Victoria, stories of a beautiful, refined woman who had left Caleb because of his scars. The same woman who, in Caleb's darkest moments, had rejected him, unable to look past the man who had been burned in a fire. Emmeline's heart sank as Victoria turned her attention to her. "Oh," Victoria said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "You've remarried." "I see." Emmeline's smile was stiff, not knowing what else to say. She was a stranger in this house, a stranger to Caleb's past. She couldn't pretend she understood everything, but she knew that this woman, this beautiful, polished woman, had once held Caleb's heart. The conversation between the two women was uncomfortable, full of strained politeness. Victoria apologized for her absence, saying, "I was young and foolish." I've regretted my decision every day. Her words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with insincerity. Emmeline, who had grown up without a family to call her own, couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the woman who had once been loved so deeply and yet had walked away. "That's very brave of you," Emmeline said quietly, trying to mask the insecurity she felt in her own heart. Victoria barely acknowledged her words, her attention already drifting back to Caleb. She had come, it seemed, not to apologize, but to reclaim what she believed had once been hers. As Victoria spoke about her new life, her father's recent purchase of the Crawford Ranch, Emmeline couldn't help but notice how she spoke about Caleb as if he were part of a business deal. "I'm staying at the Graston Hotel," Victoria said, her eyes gleaming. "My father's buying the Crawford Ranch next door. I'll be your neighbor." Caleb's silence spoke volumes. He had never fully explained why Victoria had left him, why their engagement had fallen apart. He hadn't wanted to talk about it, hadn't wanted to dredge up the pain that still lingered in the scars on his body and the scars in his heart. But with Victoria's return, the past was coming to the surface, and Emmeline felt it like a weight pressing down on her chest. The conversation continued, the tension thickening with every word Victoria spoke. She mentioned how she had once been so in love with Caleb, how she had once believed they would have a future together. But Emmeline couldn't help but feel that Victoria's words were empty, just a mask she wore to make herself feel better about the choices she had made. It wasn't long before Caleb stood up abruptly, his voice cold. "You should leave," he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. He didn't look at Emmeline as he spoke, didn't meet her eyes. He was, in that moment, caught between the past and the present, unsure of where he belonged. After Victoria left, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Caleb and Emmeline hadn't spoken much since Victoria's arrival, the silence between them growing heavier with every passing hour. Emmeline had retreated to the garden, unsure of what to think or feel. Caleb hadn't come to her, hadn't reached out the way he normally did. His absence left a void that Emmeline didn't know how to fill. She sat on the edge of the garden, pulling at the flowers she had planted, her fingers brushing the petals in an effort to distract herself from the thoughts swirling in her head. She felt foolish for letting Victoria's return affect her so much, but she couldn't help it. It was hard not to compare herself to the woman Caleb had once loved. She had the beauty, the grace, the refinement that Emmeline could never hope to have. And yet, Caleb had chosen her, the woman with torn shoes and a patched dress, the woman who had never fit into the world she had been thrown into. When Caleb finally came to find her, he didn't have the words to explain. "We need to talk about Victoria," he said, his voice low. Emmeline, unable to hide her hurt, looked at him. "There's nothing to discuss. She's your past," she said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. But Caleb's eyes told a different story. "A past I thought was buried," he said quietly, his tone heavy with regret. Emmeline's heart sank as she heard the words she had been dreading. She had been trying to push the fear away, trying to convince herself that Caleb's love for her was real, that the bond they had formed was enough to overcome everything. But now, with Victoria's return, all her insecurities had come rushing back to the surface. "And now it's here," Emmeline said, her voice barely a whisper. "Beautiful. Refined. Everything you asked for in that letter." Caleb's eyes widened as he reached for her, his voice raw. "That's not." But Emmeline pulled away, not wanting to hear the explanation. "Isn't it?" she asked, her voice breaking. She turned and walked away, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Caleb stood there, watching her go, unsure of how to fix the rift that had formed between them. He had never intended for Victoria to return. He had never wanted to bring her back into their lives, into the fragile peace he had built with Emmeline. But now that she was here, everything had changed. Emmeline couldn't shake the feeling that she was being forced into a competition she didn't belong in. The townspeople began to gossip, their whispers carrying through the streets like wildfire. "Victoria Ashford has returned," they said. She's asking about Caleb everywhere. Poor Emmeline, others murmured. Second choice, always. Emmeline could hear their voices, the sharp sting of their judgment cutting through her like a knife. It seemed that Victoria's return had brought with it not just the return of Caleb's past, but the return of her own insecurities, insecurities she had thought were long gone. As the days passed, Caleb tried to speak with her, but Emmeline had grown distant. She had begun to doubt everything she thought she knew about their relationship. When Caleb finally invited her to the hotel restaurant to meet Victoria, the tension between them reached a breaking point. Victoria, always the polished socialite, dominated the conversation with stories of their shared past, of the things they had once done together. She spoke as though she still had some claim on Caleb, as though their past was something that could be reclaimed. Emmeline, struggling to keep her composure, excused herself from the table. Victoria, ever the sharp-tongued woman, turned to Caleb with a cold smile. "She seems simple," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Sweet, but simple." Caleb's anger flared, but it wasn't the words that hurt him. It was the implication. He knew he had made a choice, and it was a choice that he couldn't take back. "Don't," he said, his voice low. "She's everything I need." With that, Caleb stood up and walked out, his heart torn between the woman he had chosen and the one he had once lost. But Emmeline was already walking away from him, lost in the shadows of the night. The past, it seemed, was never far behind, and neither was the pain it brought. Some choices shape a person's entire life, creating ripples that affect not only the individual, but everyone around them. For Caleb Merritt, the choice he now faced was one that had been years in the making, a decision that weighed heavily on his heart. The past had returned in the form of Victoria Ashford, bringing with it a flood of memories, regrets, and questions that Caleb hadn't known he still had. But Emmeline, his Emmeline, had brought something different into his life: peace, acceptance, a love that saw beyond the scars and beyond the past. Now, with the weight of his old love returning, Caleb felt the ground beneath him shift, uncertain of where he stood. And for Emmeline, this was a moment she had never truly expected to face. She had been given the love she thought impossible, and now, standing on the precipice of her own insecurities, she questioned whether she truly had a place in Caleb's life. The house had grown silent in the days following Victoria's return, Caleb's presence a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. Emmeline, too proud to admit she was struggling, kept herself busy with the ranch, immersing herself in the garden, in teaching the children, in everything that kept her hands moving and her heart from sinking. She had started packing her things, unsure of what to do next. She had always known that nothing was permanent, that happiness, like everything else in life, was fleeting. It wasn't long before Caleb realized that the distance between them was growing. She hadn't said much, but the silence between them was louder than any argument could ever be. Caleb had been avoiding her, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had formed since Victoria's return. He knew he had to make a decision, and he knew it had to be the right one, not just for him, but for Emmeline too. He couldn't lose her, not when she had already given him so much, not when she had brought something he never thought he'd find again. It wasn't just about the ranch, or the business, or the people who had expected him to marry someone like Victoria. It was about something much more. It was about the choice to love someone for who they truly were, scars and all. Caleb arrived at the house that evening to find Emmeline packing her belongings. His heart dropped as he saw her go through the motions, folding her clothes with care, as if she were preparing to leave for good. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and filled with uncertainty. Emmeline didn't look up from the trunk she was packing, her hands moving methodically, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. "I'm leaving," she said quietly, the words cutting Caleb deeper than he could have imagined. "It's best for everyone." Caleb stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floor. "Best for who?" he asked, frustration and confusion rising in his voice. Emmeline finally looked up, her eyes betraying the hurt she had been hiding. "For you," she said softly. "You can have what you wanted, what you asked for." The pain in her voice made Caleb pause, made him question everything he had done up until now. "I think you deserve Victoria," she continued, her voice trembling. "Or someone like her. Someone who fits in your world, who fits the image you wanted." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he walked toward her, kneeling beside her. "I don't want someone like her," he said, his voice urgent. "I want you." The words felt raw, as if they had been trapped inside him for so long that they had no choice but to spill out. Emmeline's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head, pulling away. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm convenient. Because I was there when you needed someone." Caleb's heart cracked at the question. He had never wanted her to feel like she was just an option, just someone who had filled the space left by the woman he had lost. "No," he said firmly. "Because you're real. You're the first real thing I've had in 5 years. You're not like anyone else. You saw me, really saw me, when no one else could." Emmeline's hands shook as she wiped the tears from her eyes. "I never wanted to be second choice," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to feel like I was just the one who was left behind." Caleb took her hands in his, holding them gently. "You're not second choice," he said, his voice full of conviction. "You're the one I've been waiting for, even if I didn't know it. I spent so much time hiding from the past, hiding from what I thought I wanted, that I didn't see what was right in front of me." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I've been praying for you, Emmeline. Not for beauty, not for refinement. I prayed for someone real. And when you stepped off at Stagecoach, I knew. I knew you were the answer to that prayer." Emmeline's breath caught in her throat as she looked into his eyes, seeing the truth of his words. "Do you know why I prayed for you?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emmeline shook her head, feeling the weight of the moment settle between them. "I prayed for someone who knew what it was like to hurt," Caleb continued, his voice shaking slightly. "Someone who had been overlooked, someone who knew what it was like to walk a hard road. I prayed for someone who wouldn't run from the things that made me who I am." He held her gaze, his eyes soft with vulnerability. "And then you came." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time in Emmeline's life, she felt like she had found a place where she truly belonged. But the doubts still lingered, and Emmeline felt the fear of losing him. "What if I'm not enough?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if I can't be who you need me to be?" Caleb's hands cupped her face, lifting her chin so that she looked him in the eye. "You are enough," he said firmly. "You've always been enough. Those torn shoes, those are the things that brought us here. They show me that you've walked through fire, that you've survived, and you've kept going. That's more than enough." Emmeline's heart soared as the weight of his words washed over her. She had never been told she was enough before, not by anyone. But Caleb was telling her now, and she believed him. In that moment, she knew that she could stay. She knew that, for the first time in her life, she could finally be loved for exactly who she was. The truth hung between them, but it wasn't a painful truth anymore. It was the truth of two people finding each other in a world that had told them they weren't enough, that had told them they didn't belong. Caleb and Emmeline's love was imperfect, just as their lives had been, but it was real. Caleb had chosen her, and she had chosen him in return. The only thing left now was to make a promise to each other, to the future they would build together. That night, as they stood together in the quiet of the garden, Caleb took her hands in his and spoke the words that would seal their fate. "I love you, Emmeline. I love you more than I ever thought I could. And I'm not going anywhere." Emmeline, her heart full, kissed him softly. "I love you too," she whispered. "And I'm not going anywhere either." Their promise, made in the soft light of the stars, was one they would keep for the rest of their lives. But their journey wasn't over, not yet. There was still one final thing that needed to be done. Victoria Ashford, who had once held Caleb's heart, needed to hear the truth. And Caleb was going to tell her, once and for all, that she had no place in his future. The next day, Caleb rode to the hotel, his heart set on what he had to do. Victoria was sitting in the sitting room, waiting for him. Her eyes flashed when she saw him, a smile spreading across her face. "Caleb, I knew you'd come back to me," she said, her voice confident. But Caleb wasn't swayed. He stood before her, his voice firm. "Victoria, I came to tell you something," he said, his gaze steady. "I'm married. I married a woman who sees me, not my scars. I married someone who understands what it means to live and love. I'm not the man you left behind, and I'm not coming back to you." Victoria's face fell, and for the first time, Caleb saw the woman he had once loved for who she truly was, a woman who had never truly seen him. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice trembling with fury. Caleb shook his head, his resolve unwavering. "No, I won't," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And you'll understand one day that what you wanted from me was never what I needed. I'm happy, and I'm not coming back." He turned and walked out, leaving the past behind for good. When Caleb returned to the ranch, Emmeline was waiting for him. She smiled, her eyes full of love and understanding. Caleb knew that, no matter what came next, he had made the right choice. And as he walked toward her, he knew that their love was the only thing that truly mattered. Together, they would face whatever came next, and they would face it as one. The days following Caleb's decision to confront Victoria were filled with a quiet sort of peace that had been long absent from the ranch. Emmeline and Caleb, though still processing everything that had happened, found themselves settling into a routine that was uniquely their own. They no longer had to carry the weight of old wounds, of unspoken words or hidden fears. The past had been put to rest, and now there was only the present, only the love they had for one another, raw and real, yet tender and full of promise. The weight of Caleb's choice had not been easy, but in the end, he had made the right decision. Victoria's return had shaken both him and Emmeline, but it had also shown them just how much they had grown. They were no longer the people who had once been so bound by their pasts. They had become something better. Two souls who had found each other through the storms of life, not despite their imperfections, but because of them. The ranch had transformed during this time. Caleb and Emmeline had worked together, side by side, on the land, cultivating it with their own hands. It wasn't just the soil that was changing, it was their hearts too. Emmeline had learned to trust in Caleb as he had learned to trust in her, and with that trust, the ranch had become a symbol of their journey together. In the mornings, Emmeline would wake early to tend to the garden, to watch the flowers she had planted begin to bloom. The small things, these simple acts of nurturing life, became metaphors for their relationship. Together, they were growing, nurturing what they had found in one another. Mrs. Winters, once a cold and distant figure in the house, had slowly begun to thaw as well. She had seen the changes in the ranch, in Caleb, and in Emmeline. Slowly but surely, she had started to let go of her own reservations. One evening, she had approached Emmeline as she worked in the garden, offering her a quiet apology. "I was wrong about you," Mrs. Winters had said, her voice softer than Emmeline had ever heard it. "You brought something here that none of us expected. You've made this house a home." Emmeline had smiled, not just because Mrs. Winters had apologized, but because she had seen it. She had seen the changes, the subtle but powerful way Emmeline had woven herself into the fabric of the ranch. That was when Emmeline truly understood that she wasn't just a visitor in Caleb's life anymore. She had a place here, one that was as solid as the land they worked together. As the weeks passed, Emmeline began to notice the subtle changes in Caleb too. He was no longer the man who had been defined by his scars or by the memory of the woman who had rejected him. He was the man who had chosen her, the woman who had chosen him. And in that choice, they had both found the healing they needed. He no longer carried the burden of the past as he once had. He was lighter, freer, and more himself than Emmeline had ever seen him. One day, as the spring sun began to set, Caleb and Emmeline were sitting on the porch of the house, watching the horizon stretch out before them. It was in these moments, quiet, unspoken, that Emmeline felt the weight of their journey together. She felt the peace that had settled between them, the peace that had been earned through patience and understanding. Caleb turned to her, his face soft with affection, and said, "I want to give you something." Emmeline looked at him, her heart quickening with anticipation. "What is it?" she asked, her voice gentle. Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, walked to the edge of the porch, and reached into the pocket of his jacket. When he returned, he held something small in his hand. It was a simple leather strap, attached to a small, tarnished charm. Emmeline's eyes widened as she saw what it was, a tiny bronze shoe, worn and weathered. "It's from your shoes," Caleb said, his voice low. "I never want you to forget how you got here." How he got here? Emmeline's breath caught in her throat as he placed the charm in her hand. It was heavy with meaning, heavier than any necklace or gift he could have given her. This was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a reminder of the journey they had taken, of the love that had brought them to this point. It was a piece of the past, but it was also a symbol of their future. "I don't need anything fancy," Emmeline whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I have everything I've ever wanted right here." Caleb smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that said everything. "Then let's make it official," he said, taking her hand in his. "Let's make this forever." The words, simple as they were, struck Emmeline to her core. Forever. That was what Caleb was offering her. And in that moment, she realized that she had never truly believed forever could be real until now. The following days were a whirlwind of preparations. Caleb, ever the quiet man, had quietly arranged everything. He had made sure that their promise to one another would be witnessed, that it would be something everyone could see, something that would be celebrated. The whole town had rallied around them, eager to help in any way they could. The harvest festival was coming, and Caleb had decided that this would be the moment. He and Emmeline would stand before God and everyone, and they would promise each other forever. The ranch house, which had always been a place of work and labor, was transformed into a place of beauty. Wildflowers, Emmeline's wildflowers, adorned every corner. The staff, Gabe, Mrs. Winters, even the maids, had all come together to help make it the perfect setting. And Emmeline, who had never imagined herself to be a bride, now stood at the center of it all, a simple woman in a white dress, her hair woven with wildflowers. She wasn't the polished woman Victoria had been. She wasn't the refined beauty everyone had expected Caleb to marry. But she was the woman Caleb had chosen, and she was the woman he would spend the rest of his life with. The ceremony took place under an arch of wildflowers, the sun low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the gathering. Caleb stood at the front, his eyes fixed on Emmeline, his heart full of love and gratitude. He had been given the greatest gift, someone who saw him for who he was, who loved him not in spite of his past, but because of it. And Emmeline, standing at the altar, looked at him with a love that spoke louder than words. She had never believed she deserved a love like this. But now, standing beside Caleb, she knew she did. They exchanged their vows, simple and true. Caleb's voice was steady as he spoke. "Emmeline Grace, you arrived when I had given up hoping. You saw my scars and called them proof. You took a broken house and made it a home. I vow to see you always the way you saw me, with clear eyes and an open heart. To stand beside you, rain or shine, till the breath leaves me." Emmeline's voice trembled as she spoke her vows. "Caleb Merritt, you were the first person who looked at me and didn't see something missing. You saw something whole. I vow to walk beside you, through storms and sunshine, in torn shoes or new ones, because the journey matters more than what we wear on it. You taught me that being enough isn't about perfection, it's about being real." The ceremony ended with a kiss, and the crowd erupted in applause. It was a simple ceremony, but it was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever known. As the sun set, casting a soft light over the ranch, Caleb and Emmeline stood together, their hands intertwined. Their love was real, and now it was sealed. Later that evening, as the reception unfolded with laughter and joy, Emmeline found herself standing in the garden, watching the stars. Caleb joined her, his arms slipping around her waist. "I never thought this would be my life," she said, her voice full of wonder. "I never thought I could have this." Caleb kissed her forehead softly. "It's just the beginning," he whispered. And it was because that night, with the stars above them and the wildflowers blooming at their feet, Emmeline knew that forever had begun. A few months later, when the harvest festival had long passed and life had settled into the rhythm of the ranch, Caleb and Emmeline returned to the Graston Depot. A stagecoach was arriving, and as it pulled into the station, Emmeline saw a young woman step down from the coach. She was alone, and she had the same look of uncertainty that Emmeline had once had. She clutched a letter in her hand, her shoes worn and dirty. Emmeline stepped forward, recognizing the fear in the girl's eyes. "Are you Sarah Brennan?" Emmeline asked gently. The young woman nodded. "I'm here for the teaching position," she said, her voice shaking. "But there's been a mistake. I have no references." Emmeline smiled and stepped forward, offering her a package. "There's no mistake," Emmeline said softly. "You came anyway. That's qualification enough." She handed the young woman the package. Inside were new shoes, just as she had once received. A note accompanied them, just as Caleb had written for her, for the journey ahead. "Keep your old ones. They brought you here." The young woman looked up, tears in her eyes. "Why would you?" she began, but Emmeline interrupted her with a smile. "Because someone gave me a chance when I had nothing but torn shoes and hope." And in that moment, Emmeline realized that the legacy of their love, their journey, wasn't just about the two of them. It was about passing that love on, about giving someone else the chance to walk the road they had walked, to find their own place in the world. As she watched the young woman walk away, Emmeline felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. She had found her place, and in that place, she had found love. Forever.